Let's take a look at Unit 3, configuring EAP 6 in domain mode. Part of this unit, we will take a look at an overview on a domain, take a look at some necessary components part of the domain mode settings, and also how to start the domain controller when you're starting up using the domain.sh, and how to configure a particular controller as a domain controller or a host master controller, followed by a lab setting up a domain controller. Then we'll get into the other slave host controllers, how to configure them, and then also compare with the domain XML file, host XML file. These two files basically will be used by any controllers when it starts up. A combination of those two will set up a controller, and then followed by two labs, a host controller lab and then an application deployment in a domain mode, how to do that. When you look at a domain mode here in EAP 6, you have a domain controller and two host controller here. This is actually in EAP 6 similar to the other vendor's product, kind of a central configuration, a domain controller acting as a central configuration server where this host controller can pull information. So whenever you're making configuration changes using CLI or the management console, you connect to the domain controller and then you make changes that will propagate the changes to this host controller, where this host controller, as you can see here, where you have your actual JBoss servers running. Like a server A, that's actually an EAP server 6 instance, and server B is another instance. So this host controller, typically on another separate host, you have a host controller that manages these particular EAP instances, the server A and B. And here's another host controller on another particular host, and actually managing these three EAP 6 server instances. In a domain controller, we also have a concept of a server group. Each server must belong to a server group. As you can notice here, we have a server group X, where it actually grouping server from host 1 and also server from host 2, server A and C. Then you can see there's a server group Z, which is actually grouping the two servers in host controller 2, server D and server E. Now you also have a server B, which is a single server, but it also must belong to a group. When it comes to a domain mode, we target everything to a group. You can't actually target an application to an individual server. Rather, you can target an application to a server group. With the server group, when you configure server group, you specify which profile that you're going to use, whether it's a full or full HA or HA profiles that you want to use, and also what kind of sockets you're going to use for each of the profiles. You actually configure all that part of a group, and then any server that belongs to a group, regardless of wherever they're running, will assume the same settings. So if you target an application to a server group X, then it will be available on server A and also server C. So you can actually target an application on an individual server. If that you want, then you will be doing something like this here, server B on a server group Y. You target an application to server group Y, then it will only be available on the server B, which one server belong to this group. So there's a verbal quiz there, part of your course material. Go through that, try to answer these questions. So you have a domain controller and a host controller. Typically in a domain controller, you don't try to manage server. If you want to manage server, you could, but typically that's not the best practice. And these domain controller, host controllers, these are simply a daemon process. Whenever you start them, it actually will start up two controller process. One is the host controller process, another one is a process controller process. So they'll start up as two daemon process. And on top of that, any EAP instance you start up, EAP server instance you start up, will also actually have another daemon process.